I have an object here with two properties, and so far we've been used to accessing and assigning properties using the dot notation like this, or the bracket notation in cases where the name of the property is a variable. It turns out that these properties also have some configuration data associated with them that we just haven't seen yet. But if we want to, we can create properties on this object that have custom configurations. Let me show you what I mean. Let's add a third property to this object. To do that, I'm going to use the define property function. It takes the object that we want to add the property to as the first parameter, and then the name of the property as the second. So let's call this full name. The final property will be an object of configuration options. For example, I can provide a value option, and that will be the default value for full name. So for now, why don't we just say that the default value is default value. Oops. Now when I save that and go over to the console and inspect the object, we can see we have three properties now, and one of them is full name. And notice it has that default value as its value. So if I say full name and access the property, the value that I get back is a string that is set to default value. Now let's say I want to change the full name property value. So just like with normal properties, I'll call o.fullname and then set it equal to something else. Let's say eventedMind. If we look at the object now, notice that the value of full name hasn't actually changed. It's still default value. And the reason for that is when we create properties using this define property function, by default these properties are not writable. Unlike when we define the properties this way up here using the object literal syntax. So to fix that, I'm going to come in here and add another option to this property called writable. And by default, this will be set to false. So we're going to change that to true so that we can actually write to this property. So let me come back into the console, and now I'll assign this to its new value of eventedMind. And let's take a look at the object now. Notice that the value has changed this time to eventedMind. Okay, sometimes it's useful to be able to iterate over an object's properties. For example, when we're copying one object to another. I'm going to show you how to do this specifically in another video, but for now let me show you a function called keys. And what this function does is, given an object, it returns an array of the object's property names. So notice here that we have the two property names, first name and last name, but our full name property is not showing up. And that's because by default, the properties created this way are not enumerable. What enumerable means is that we can iterate over a list of the property names, or that they'll be returned in this array by using the keys function. So to fix that, let's add an option here called enumerable and set it to true, because it will be false by default. So over in the console, I'll try now calling the keys function again, and this time around, we see the full name properties show up in the list. Let's say I want to update the configuration of an existing property. To do that, I can call the define property function again, using the name of the property that I want to update. So let's just pretend that we want to make this no longer enumerable, so I'm going to set it back to false. And then when I save the document, notice in the console we get an error saying that we can't redefine the property full name. The reason for that is because there's another option here called configurable, and by default it's set to false. What this means is that after the initial configuration, we can't redefine or reconfigure this property like we're doing down here. If I want the property to be configurable in the future, I can just set this value to true. And now that error goes away, and our property will no longer be enumerable because we reset the property. So if I say object keys, notice full name is no longer in that list. One of the coolest things we can do with configuring properties is to provide a getter and a setter function. So I'll provide another option here called get, and this allows us to set a function that will get called anytime a user accesses this property, so we can execute some custom logic here. In this case, I'm just going to say that we're getting the full name, and then we'll return the first name, a space, and the last name. And this inside of this function points to the object. And the object is right here. When I save this, I'll get an error in the console, and the error says that I can't have both accessors be writable or have a value. What that means is that once we provide a get function like this, we need to get rid of this value property and the writable property, because they don't really make sense anymore. Now in the console, let's say that we want to access this full name. So I'll press enter, and we print to the console getting the full name, and now we return a string that says evented mind. We can also provide a setter function that takes a value as a parameter. You have to figure out where you're actually going to set this value. So what we can do is just, for now, say that there's a private or an underscore property on the object. This doesn't actually make it private like it would in Java, but it just signals to users that this should be a private property. And so we could say that this dot full name is equal to the value, but let's just modify it so that we can see that something is happening here. And then inside of this getter function, instead of returning the first and last name, let's just return the value that's set in the setter function. Okay, now over in the console, when I access full name, this time it should be undefined because full name is not defined yet. But if I assign this now, we can say full name and access the property, and now we get back some value underscore modified. And if I look at the object itself, you can see that that value has indeed been assigned. In this video, we looked at how a property on an object is configurable, and the way we can configure it is by providing some configuration options to the define property function, which takes the object as a first parameter, the name of the property as a second, and then a bunch of these options. If you want to learn more about how a configuration works with define property, I suggest you go over and check out MDN's documentation on the define property function.